with James DiEugenio. He is the publisher and editor of KennedysandKing.com, and he's also the author of the JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today. You want to tell us a little bit about this new book, Jim?
Yeah, sure, Dave. Um, JFK, the JFK assassination, the evidence today is an updated and revised edition of Reclaiming Parkland. Okay. Um, it Most of the additions to it are in part three, all right, in which I talk about mainly the influence of Tom Hanks and Spielberg on some of the products that are coming out and how they are so disappointingly disjointed with what we know to be historical facts. And the three films I concentrated on are Charlie Wilson's War, Parkland, and The Post. And those are really, I believe, kind of irresponsible films. And there's, the MSM goes after Oliver Stone. I mean, compared to Oliver Stone, I mean, Tom Hanks is a sixth grader. He simply doesn't have a very sophisticated view of contemporary history, but somehow he thinks he does. And so, therefore, him and to a lesser degree Spielberg make a movie like The Post, in which I don't even think they understood the Pentagon Papers case or knew anything about it. All right, to give you an example, I talked to the in-house attorney at the New York Times at the time of the Pentagon Papers case. He told me, Jim, you think what's there is now is bad. In the first draft of the script, Daniel Ellsberg was in this movie for one scene, and the New York Times was not there at all. I couldn't believe it. The Pentagon Papers case essentially is Daniel Ellsberg. Without him, there would have been no smuggling the papers out of the Rand Corporation. Now, the other two parts of the book deal with Vincent Bugliosi, and the second part of the book deals with an analysis of the evidence in the Kennedy case today and how it compares what Bugliosi's presentation was in Reclaiming History. And in that part of the book, the second part of the book, that's where I really go in to what we know about the JFK case today. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is a little bit different, because what we're going to talk about is an essay I did at my website, KennedysandKing.com. And as you know, David, although I write something about the Tippit case in the JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, this particular essay, I borrowed a lot from a lot of different people to try and coalesce what the evidence in the Tippit case is today. All right. Now, I know you've read the essay, right?
Yeah, it was a really interesting amalgamation of all of the different authors I've heard that have written about it, like Joseph McBride, Bill Simpich, and many others. So it was really interesting to see it all laid out together.
Yeah. See, what I did, and I'm glad you gave those other writers credit, I tried to do it from, it begins with an historical point of view. In other words, this is what the Warren Commission said. Then I expand out to what authors like Henry Hurt in his book Reasonable Doubt, and then Jim Garrison in his book On the Trail of the Assassins. All right. And I summarize their work on the Tippit case. And I guess the best way to deal with that is to say that both Henry Hurt and Jim Garrison felt that there were problems with what's commonly called the core evidence, or hard evidence, or ballistics evidence in that case. And there is. There most definitely is. Anybody who knows the JFK case will understand these issues. All right. For example, the bullets could not be matched to the gun that Oswald allegedly used to shoot Tippit. And this was because the chambers in the gun had been altered, all right, to accommodate something called 38 special ammunition, which is a 38 packed with a little bit more gunpowder, all right, to make it more powerful. And so when the bullet is dislodged through the chamber, it doesn't make the proper markings in order to be identified. So now what makes that so odd is that the Dallas police only sent one bullet up to the FBI, all right, to be examined. But there were at least 3 other bullets that hit Tippit. Why would you only send one bullet up? The Warren Commission sent down the FBI, Cortland Cunningham, to find the other 3 bullets. All right, and so he found the other 3 bullets, and they didn't match either. Now, everything was relying upon the shells. But here's the problem with the shells. The shells were not even listed on the police report on the first day. In fact, they didn't enter into the report until 6 days later. But what makes that even worse is that the first police reports said that they were automatic shells. Automatics, of course, are different than revolvers. The Warren Commission decided Oswald used a revolver. But anybody can see in a comparison that automatic shells look different, than the kind of ammunition used in a revolver. And they also are stamped at the bottom AUTO. So it's very hard to believe that Jerry Hill, who was the guy who radioed in that they were automatic, okay, could mistake an automatic shell for a revolver shell. All right, and because he had been a veteran of the force for a number of years. The delay in getting the other bullets and the delay in getting the shells up to the FBI building for testing, made a lot of people suspect something was funny with this. And in fact, Jim Garrison, in his book On the Trail of the Assassins, strongly suspected that the evidence was switched. That once they didn't get the bullet match, that they went ahead and fired the gun they had in possession to get the shells to match. Right? And I think, don't you, that because it was a 6-day delay, it wasn't on the original inventory? One would have to think, well, that is kind of justified, isn't it? That kind of suspicion.
Sure. And we'll talk later about the Dallas police's reputation at that time. I really want to cover that a little bit, so it's definitely...
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that later. Okay, it's completely justified in light of those facts that will come out later in this interview. Now, another problem with the Tippit case was the timing. All right, and what I mean by that is that the Warren Commission said that Oswald, after the shooting of Kennedy, left work, was driven by a taxi to his rooming house in Oak Cliff, that he was only at the rooming house for a short period of time, that he picked up his revolver, and walked outside and went to a corner across the street. And that corner, by the way, accommodates a bus line that if you get on board the bus goes the wrong way from 10th and Peyton, which is the scene of the Tippit shooting. But anyway, that's the last time the landlady saw him. And she said that he was there at about 1:04. All right. Well, the Warren Commission tells us that Oswald then walked from that corner to 10th and Peyton, and Tippit was killed at about 1:15. And of course, they say Oswald did it. Now, the problem with this is a distance of about 9/10 of a mile. And that creates a problem because it's hard to believe somebody can walk 9/10 of a mile in something like 11 minutes. And by the way, and I know two researchers who did walk that route, and they were both much taller than Oswald. All right, and they said, we power walked it. We didn't just normally walk it because we didn't come close to 11 minutes. All right. So this begins to be a problem. The time of 1:15 for the shooting of Oswald is simply not supported by the weight of the evidence. All right. There's several witnesses like Mrs. Donald Higgins and, for example, Helen Markham, Roger Craig, T.F. Bowley, who all say that the shooting occurred a few minutes before that. And for example, T.F. Bowley had a watch on. Roger Craig had a watch on. These witnesses placed the shooting of Tippit much closer to about 1:06 or 1:07. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that if it's hard to believe Oswald could have got to the Tippit shooting at 1:15, it's simply not possible to believe that he could have got there at 1:07 or even 1:08.
Right.
Okay, I mean, like I said in my article, Roger Bannister, 9 years before, was the first guy to break the record of 4 minutes, the 4-minute barrier in the mile. All right? So it's simply not possible to imagine Oswald even running that distance in 4 minutes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, in the military, I think that's about an 8-minute mile is very good, to run. So,
yeah, right. Okay. So, now the clincher for this, of course, is what I have listed in my article, is the Tippit death certificate executed by Dr. Richard LaCourie at Methodist Hospital. It places his death at 1:15 p.m. is the time of death. Now, considering that the ambulance had to go out and get the guy, all right, and then bring him back to the hospital, and he looks up at the clock and it says 1:15, then how could he be killed at, it makes no sense. And as we go here in the caption, it actually looks like the 1:15 is typed over an even earlier time of 1:09. All right, but we'll accept the 1:15. Now, with those factors into the record, then you get the problem with the witnesses. Domingo Benavides was allegedly the closest witness to the crime scene. Back then in 1963-64, he failed to identify Oswald. Warren Reynolds was also an eyewitness. Okay, saw the guy running away from the scene. Said he would not commit to identifying Oswald. Then he was shot through the head, and he changed his mind, and now he said he would identify Oswald. All right, Helen Markham has so many problems, that in the literature, she's kind of legendary. All right, so I don't even want to deal with her, but I would just say, as I wrote in my essay, the lawyers on the Warren Commission didn't even want to use her. And I quote Joseph Ball and Wesley Liebler, all right, as lawyers who did not want to use her because she had so many problems as a witness. All right, but the reason they had to use her, you had people like Scoggins, who didn't really see the scene unobstructed and had a hard time picking out Oswald after a set of pictures were shown to him. He actually picked the wrong guy. All right. And then you had Ted Calloway, who said that he saw the guy running from the scene, but then he asked Benavides, which way did he go? Well, if Calloway had to ask Benavides which way did he go, how did he see him then?
Right.
All right. And also I go into the problems with the lineups. The lineups of the Dallas Police Department were very unfair, to say the least. I quote William Whaley, the cab driver, who said, you could have picked out Oswald without identifying him by just listening to him, because he was bawling out to policemen, telling them it wasn't right to put him in line with these teenagers. All right. And then he says anybody who wasn't sure could have picked him out, the right one, just for that. But further, when asked for names and occupations, the other people in the lineup who were policemen gave fictitious answers. Oswald said his real name and said he worked at a Texas School Book Depository. So what the heck kind of lineup is that? You know, it's just a joke. So now we go to what I like to call one of the most interesting aspects of the Tippit case, is that the bullets don't match the shells. In other words, what I mean by that is that, as other people have pointed out before, the bullets taken from Tippit's body, 3 are Winchester Western manufactured, copper coated. The last is a lead bullet made by Remington Peters. As Garrison noted, this seemed to suggest that 2 men may have fired at Tippit. But the shells, of course, did not match the bullets. 2 of the shells were by Remington and 2 by Winchester. And this has led some people to think that maybe there was a shot that missed and a shell that was not recovered. The House Select Committee on Assassination suggested this, but labeled it as speculation. According to the Warren Commission, Oswald took the time to actually empty the revolver. So when you empty a revolver manually, there's not like unless you're going to say he was running, there's not much of a space, for the guy to go ahead and disperse of all those bullets. So now the idea, though, is that the authorities, like I said, only sent 1 bullet up, okay? And then they sent the other 3. Then they sent the shells, and I talked about the delay in that. But just when you think that things can't get any worse, and by the way, as I quote in the article, it's not just the critics who have said that there's a problem with the chain of possession. Hale Boggs himself, one of the Warren commissioners, said, what proof do you have that these are the bullets? Now, further complicating that, Jerry Hill said he told an officer, J.M. Poe, to mark the shells. His marks were not evident when the policeman inspected the exhibits for the commission. Further, when the witnesses who found the other 2 shells were asked by the FBI to identify them as the ones they originally recovered, they could not. Now, just when you think it can't get any worse, Joe McBride, who wrote a book on the Tippit case, Into the Nightmare, said he talked to Detective Jim Lavelle in 1992, and Lavelle makes everything a little worse by saying that nobody actually really did mark the shells at all. So what he's doing is he calls Poe a liar. That's what he's saying. And now he says that there really isn't a problem with the substitution of evidence. But as McBride noted, what he had really done is it makes the whole chain of evidence custody on the shells very highly suspect. In other words, nobody knows what happened to these shells. It's such a mess today.
Do you want to just briefly talk about what chain of custody means?
Yeah. Chain of custody is very important when you're talking about a homicide case, because what that means is that the investigating officers should clearly mark and make reports of all the evidence found at the scene. And for a long, long time, and even the Dallas police will tell you this, they were giving carving pens in which they were supposed to use those to mark the evidence at the scene. And then when they turned it over to someone, that person was supposed to put his initials on the evidence. Okay? Then there's supposed to be a report saying that, okay, so-and-so picked this up at the scene, carved his initials into it at such and such a time, on such and such a day. He brought it down to the station, turned it over to this guy, and his initials are on it. Okay? He gave him a receipt. He wrote a report, and then he checked it into the evidence room. And then whoever checks it into the evidence room signs his name on the ledger, okay? And then the guy collecting the evidence goes ahead and marks it in that ledger, that the evidence was marked by such and such a person and a second person, and they turned it into me at such and such a time on such and such a day. See, that way, which is standard procedure, okay, that way, then the defense attorney cannot question whether or not somebody or more than one person substituted the evidence. But with what you have in this case, I mean, it's just it violates all of those rules that police officers are taught from the beginning. You know, with the whole thing about there being no shells, on the report for 6 days, that they only sent one bullet to the FBI, that Hill told Poe to go ahead and carve his initials into it, but somehow Poe can't find it. And then Lavelle, this giant curveball saying, no, they didn't mark it at all. Why they wouldn't mark it at all, that just completely eludes me. All right, now, because of the problems with the shells and bullets, and because of a witness named Akila Clemens, who worked as a caretaker about a block away, she heard the shots, ran down the street. She said she saw two men at the scene, okay? One was tall and slender. The other one was kind of a short guy, all right? And then the tall guy waved at the shooter and told him to go on, and they ran off in different directions. There was also a letter to Playboy magazine in January in the January 1968 issue, where an anonymous person agreed with Clemens. He had been at the scene of the crime, and he saw two men run off in different directions, neither one of them being Oswald. Now, if this isn't bad enough, it's pretty bad if you ask me, now we come to the radio transcripts. The Warren Commission was delivered 3 different versions of the police transcripts. Sylvia Marr pointed out that the first transcript the police turned over did not include what was perhaps the most important instruction given to Tippit that day. That was the order for him to move into Central Oak Cliff at 12:45. That was about 15 minutes after Kennedy was killed, but there was a problem with this order. First of all, 3 officers who said they heard the transcripts said that they did not refer to this order during their testimony before the Warren Commission. Also, right before this order, the radio dispatcher had said, quote, "Attention all squads, report to downtown area, code 3. That means sirens blaring and red light flashing to Elm and Houston with caution," which, of course, makes perfect sense. You want as many cars as you can down there in Dealey Plaza. So why would you send not 1 but 2 officers to Oak Cliff, which is away from Dealey Plaza? The question then became, was that order genuine, or was it planted on the second version of the radio transcripts? All right, now the Warren Commission didn't suspect any chicanery because they were just happy to find a way to get Tippit into Oak Cliff. By the way, out of his territory at that time. And secondly, what was so important about Central Oak Cliff anyway? Because nobody had radioed in any disturbance to that area. Now, with the Warren Commission, things always get worse, and now it's about to get worse. There's no acknowledgement of this order, even though it was given to 2 policemen, Tippit and R.C. Nelson. To top it off, the police already had a guy in Oak Cliff. His name was William Menzel. So in other words, when cars are coming in from the outermost areas to the Dealey Plaza area. Not one, but two cars are being directed to Oak Cliff when, in fact, they already have a guy there. And further, there's no contact between the dispatcher, Murray Jackson, and Mansell to check on where he is. But, and like I said, it always gets worse, Nelson didn't go to Dealey Plaza. Nelson didn't go to Oak Cliff. He went to Dealey Plaza. As many authors, like Henry Hurd, have noted, the Warren Commission never made anything out of this paradox. In other words, why did Tippit go to Oak Cliff, but Nelson did not? And in fact, neither the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee called Nelson as a witness. See, that is the kind of thing that makes people suspect that that order was added later.
All
right, now, at 12:54, Tippit stated he was at Lancaster and 8th. And then Murray Jackson, the dispatcher, replies with one of the strangest radio instructions one could imagine for that time. Jackson told Tippit to, quote, be at large for any emergency that comes in. Okay, be at large for any emergency that comes in. Now, we come to the message at 1:08. Between 12:45 and 1:08, there were 4 messages involving Tippit. 3 went from the dispatcher to Tippit. 1 came in from Tippit at 1:08. In one version of the message, Tippit called the dispatcher twice and got no answer. In the FBI version, though, Tippit's call number at that time, which was 78, is missing from the radio tapes. It's assigned to a guy at number 488. The FBI noted that the sound was garbled and number 488 is not identified by his name, and there is no other message assigned to whoever this person is. Bill Drennis, who researched the Tippit case and wrote an essay on it, did a thorough examination of the tape and the transcripts. He also concluded that the voice is not Tippit's at 1:08. So in other words, what the Dallas police looked like they were trying to do was to put this message at 1:08. They were trying to put it on there in order to go ahead and move the time of the shooting forward in time, all right? So this is very, very, let's say, intriguing, okay? It's very, very intriguing because Mrs. Higgins, one of the women who was a witness right across the street, said the murder was at 1:06. She ran outside, and she's another person who saw someone fleeing the scene, and it wasn't Oswald. All right, now, what I've done so far with this is I've tried to summarize the evidence in the case before Oliver Stone's 1991 film, JFK, came out. As everyone knows, that movie created a kind of mini earthquake throughout the land. And it created a lot of other people writing books, making documentaries, etc. One of these authors was James Hosty, the FBI agent who was assigned to the Oswald case in 1963 in Dallas. He wrote a book called Assignment Oswald. In that book, which was published in 1995, he revealed an utterly fascinating piece of information, one that had been concealed for 32 years. He said that his FBI colleague, Bob Barrett, was at the scene of the Tippit murder. Barrett said that Captain William Westbrook asked him, have you ever heard of a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald? Barrett said no. Westbrook then asked him, how about Alec Heidel? Barrett now turned around and he saw that Westbrook was leafing through somebody's wallet at the scene. Now, later on, this remarkable development was fortified by the release of a film from TV station WFAA. And in that film, you can actually see the police handling the wallet. And I actually have pictures of this, interspersed the article, and then I have a link to a local ABC news feature in Dallas from 2013. So in other words, the evidence is that there really was an Oswald wallet found at the scene of the Tippit shooting. Now, the problem with this is that the official story has always said that the police took the wallet from Oswald in the car. after they picked him up at the Texas Theater and drove him to the station. That responsibility was given to an officer named Lieutenant Bentley. But further, there was also a wallet found at the home of Ruth and Michael Payne, where Lee Harvey Oswald had spent the night before with his wife, Marina. So the question then becomes, well, just count them. Who the heck carries 3 wallets? David, how many wallets do you have?
Just the one.
Yeah, same here. I only have 1. Who the heck carries 3? You know? So this is really, really bizarre. And so people like Bugliosi in his book tried to say that it was actually Tippit's wallet. Well, that's simply not true, because the police went after they took his body to the hospital. They picked up his effects, and among the effects was a wallet. All right, and they transferred it back to the police station. That was development number 1. Okay, now development number 2 about this wallet was that nobody saw it on the ground. Nobody saw it on the ground. All right, which indicates a possibility. Did someone bring the wallet to the scene? And this began to focus attention on 3 people, and that would be Westbrook, Reserve Officer Ken Croy, and a witness named Doris Holan. Okay, Doris Holan was one of these witnesses, like Akila Clemens, like Mrs. Higgins, and some others, who were at the scene of the Tippit shooting but were never interviewed by the Warren Commission. There isn't even any evidence that she was interviewed by the Dallas police or the FBI, which is really weird, because her house, her apartment, is on the 2nd floor of a house right across the street from where Tippit was shot. And there's a diagram in my article which shows that. But being on the 2nd floor of that house, when she was finally discovered by local Dallas researchers Michael Brownlow and Bill Palte, she had some very interesting information to convey to them. She said that as she looked out her 2nd floor window upon hearing the shots, she saw a 2nd police car at the scene. It was in the driveway between 404 and 410 East 10th Street. This was adjacent to the spot where Tippit's car stopped. So knowingly or unknowingly, Tippit blocked the driveway, which led to an alley at the middle of the block behind. She said that a man got out of the car, looked at Tippit's body, then went back down the driveway. He was alongside the car, which was retreating back towards the alley. She also saw a man fleeing the scene in a different direction. Now, it's a good thing they got her on the record, because she passed away in the year 2000. And Brownlow got some corroborating evidence for what she saw, which I list in the article here. All right. Sam Ginyard, who worked at a used car lot, also said that he saw that 2nd police car. And so this gets very, very interesting now, because now the question became, who was in the car? Now people began to focus on Westbrook and Kenneth Croy, because Westbrook is a guy who talked to Barrett about the wallet. Ken Croy was a guy who supposed to have discovered the wallet. This gets kind of interesting, because Westbrook was not a detective. He was not a patrolman. He worked in the personnel department. In other words, he interviewed applicants for jobs, and he investigated complaints. When you read these 2 guys' testimony in the Warren Commission, you really wonder just how bad the Warren Commission really was. Westbrook said that he let his men go to the Texaco Book Depository, and he was the only one left in his office. He said he got antsy, and then he said, believe it or not, he decided to walk to the depository alone, which is about a mile away. He said he would stop every few minutes, and when he saw somebody with a radio, to understand what was happening in the investigation, even though, of course, he had his own police radio. So this would consume probably about 20 minutes. So in other words, his whereabouts were unexplained for that 20 minutes. Now, Westbrook testified that once he got there, he heard that an officer had been shot in the Oak Cliff area. Now, listen to this. He said that since he was in personnel, he thought he should investigate the murder. Does that make any sense to you, David?
No.
A guy in the personnel department felt he had to investigate a homicide? Now, although Westbrook mentioned Barrett in his commission testimony, he never told the commission about the wallet and his conversation with Barrett. While at the scene of the Tippit murder, Westbrook said the word about a suspect at Texas Theater came over the radio. He got a ride to the theater. Someone tipped him off as to where the suspect was sitting. He witnessed the arrest and directed that the suspect be escorted out the theater and to the station. He then went back to his work desk in the personnel department. In other words, this is supposed to be all in a day's work for a personnel officer, right? Westbrook just happened to be at the Texas Theater, at the murder scene for Tippit, and at Dealey Plaza, all right? But he's also credited with finding the Tippit killer's jacket, and he also went to a nearby library to investigate a false alarm about the assailant of Tippit being there. Funny thing about the jacket, although he's credited with finding the jacket, he says he didn't really find it. He said somebody gave it to him, but doesn't remember who the officer was. Now that's kind of, isn't that kind of weird?
Right, and you'll go over later. That's not the only thing that he was not able to remember what he got, a piece of important evidence.
Yes. All right. Well, we're going to find that is going to be paralleled with Ken Croy.
Oh, I do want to throw one thing in that I think you mentioned it, but the personnel department, it doesn't sound like much, but for somebody who wants to be in control of, the personnel department is the guy who handles the hiring, the firing, all of the disciplinary matters. So if someone like the CIA or whatever had a key position in the Dallas Police Department, and you mention it later, so I don't want to talk about it, but, he's definitely in a key position, even though it's definitely not a investigative position or a street cop position.
Yeah, you're exactly right. He would know everybody in the whole department, and he would have the background stories on all of them. All right? So you're exactly right about that. Now, in addition to Westbrook not knowing who gave him the jacket, Croy, who was the first person at the Tippit shooting scene, was supposedly the first person to handle the wallet. And guess what? He says, well, geez, I don't remember who gave me the wallet either. Okay. The Dallas police really had a sure funny way of handling evidence, didn't they? Now, first of all, Croy was not a regular officer. He was a reserve officer. Or he said he drove patrol car duty maybe once a month. And in one of the really funniest parts of this whole story, he says that at the time of the assassination, he was just a few blocks away from Dealey Plaza. He drove to the nearby courthouse to see if the police might need some help. Now, the nearby courthouse, I have a map of this in my article, is like a block and a half away from Dealey Plaza. Now, imagine the mayhem that's going on in Dealey Plaza at this time. You've got people running around with their chickens with their head cut off. You got people running around behind, the grassy knoll at the overpass. People are starting to go into the parking lot. There's dozens of cops, FBI guys there, all within a block and a half of where he is. So what does he say he did? He said he saw a cop at the courthouse. He asked him if he needed some help. Evidently, the cop said, no, everything is fine. So Croy said that he decided that he was going to go home, when he heard a call about a cop being shot. All right. If you can believe it, Bert Griffin, who was asking him questions, didn't bat an eyelash at that story. Didn't ask him any questions, didn't challenge him, didn't even say, okay, who was the cop who told you that you could go home? None of that happened. So, in other words, like with Westbrook, there isn't really any way to corroborate Croy's whereabouts at this time. And we're going to get into a really funny thing about that later also. So once he hears a thing about the cop being shot, he drives out, he says, to 10th and Peyton, the scene of the murder. He says from his description, he said he interviewed Helen Markham. All right. But when Griffin asked him about his interview with Helen Markham, Croy said something really, really incredible. I mean, really something. Now, imagine what's happened so far. First, you have the president being shot in Dealey Plaza. Croy is a block and a half away at that time. He asked the guy, "Do you need me?" The guy evidently said no, so he's going to go home, and hears the radio about Tippit being killed. Of course, his name wasn't Tippit. Nobody knew who it was. Just a cop being killed. And so he now drives out to 10th and Peyton. He's the first guy there. A witness starts talking to him. He's the first person to see the witness or take her testimony. He tells Bert Griffin that he didn't file a report on his activities that day. Again, Griffin didn't bat an eyelash. I would have been jumping out of my seat. I said, "Wait a minute. You're the first guy at the scene where this guy was killed, and you saw his body laying in the street in a pool of blood, and a witness comes up to you, starts telling you what happened, and you don't file a report? You didn't even write her name down?" Very, very, very weird, I think. Croy said he was at 10th and Peyton for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more. When Griffin asked him what he did after he left, he said he went to get something to eat. He also said that he stayed home the rest of the day. Again, Griffin let this pass. There isn't a question by Griffin, "Well, why didn't you go to the police station and write a report? And if you didn't want to write a report, why didn't you give him a verbal report?" None of that was in there. He said he saw several officers there that he knew, but he didn't know them by name. He said he only knew them by sight. So we're led to believe that even if Croy had written a report, he wouldn't have been able to name anybody of the officers there. Now, as Croy left the scene, he drove near the Texas Theater. He saw squad cars around the building. He decided not to stop since he felt the situation was well in hand. After first telling Griffin he was going to get something to eat and go home, he then said he was actually met his estranged wife at Austin's barbecue. And this is where Croy's story gets even more bizarre. He now added towards the end of his testimony that right after Kennedy's assassination, and the cop he talked to said he was not needed, his wife, his estranged wife, drove up next to him, and he asked her if she wanted to go get something to eat. Now, consider this. Croy was in uniform. He was just off Dealey Plaza, okay? You can literally see Dealey Plaza plain as day from that site, all right? Okay? And somehow, he asked his estranged wife if she wanted a hamburger. Like I wrote in this map, underneath this map diagramming this, I said, don't you think this would make for a good Saturday Night Live skit?
Incredibly incurious guy, I guess.
Really? I mean, this stuff it's too funny to be true. Now, again, there's no record if Griffin checked this out. Like, I couldn't find anything where Griffin checked this out with the cop who supposedly told him he could go home, or if his wife actually pulled alongside him within a block and a half of Dealey Plaza. Now, Croy is important because when the story about the wallet finally did break, he was the policeman who was credited with handling it. His story that it was handed the wallet by a civilian. And of course, Croy never asked the name of the witness who gave it to him. It's like this guy was operating in a fog. The question is, was the fog designed or was it accidental? I think that's a natural question to pose. Now, with this new evidence that we have now, that is, with Barrett's testimony, with the television film of the wallet, with Doris Holan, with what we can discern from Westbrook and Croy, you have to wonder, what would a real investigator do with this kind of thing? And I think there's a lot of things he could have done with it, which I described, in the article, because the question has always been, as Bob Tannenbaum once said, who was a deputy counsel for the House Select Committee on the Kennedy side. He said, at a speech he gave in Chicago in 1993, I like to get down to fundamentals. My opening question for an investigation would be, why did Tippit stop Oswald? Which is an interesting question, because the original story on this was that the description of Oswald came through a guy named Howard Brennan. Okay, and we're supposed to believe that from 100 feet away and 6 stories up, that he managed to convey a description of the guy's height and weight. Even though the fact that the window was only partly open, and as Tannenbaum said, it's not a floor-to-ceiling window. So how could the description be accurate? The description was supposed to say that he was 5'10", about 165 pounds. If you've ever been to Dealey, and if you've ever been to that window, which the first year I was there, they didn't have it blocked off. I could actually go to the window. It's very difficult to believe that you get that kind of a description, a full body description from that window. The official story says that he gave this description to Police Inspector Herbert Sawyer, but Sawyer did not confirm that it was Brennan who gave him that information. The other side can say what they want, and I critique Gerald Posner because he's the one who says in his book that Brennan gave to Sawyer, but there's no information in his footnote that such is the case. In fact, the footnote he uses said that the information came from a man who said that the guy was on the 4th or 5th floor or might not even be in the building. So how could that be Brennan? The FBI investigated this. In other words, how did the description get to the Dallas police? They investigated this for months on end. They finally gave up. About a year after, investigator Richard Roge wrote a memo saying that he could not find who this person was, and the FBI was going to label it as an unidentified citizen. The House Select Committee decided not to use Brennan. But also what makes this interesting is in a description that went out over the police radio, it said that the suspect was armed with a rifle, namely either a .30-30 or some type of Winchester. So why would Tippit stop someone clearly armed without calling for a backup first? But of course, we know that whoever shot Tippit did not likely have a rifle. So again, why did Tippit stop this person? It's a real mystery. So what happens is that the other side has come up with the thing that somehow Oswald changed direction when he saw the car, and this was what made him suspicious. But Mike Griffith, who's a very good researcher and writer, has kind of blown that up and said you can only say that if you use people who changed their story. If you look at the initial reports by the witnesses to the police and the Secret Service, nobody says that that happened. They all said that Oswald was going in one direction, towards the police car. In other words, the distinct possibility is that Tippit did not pull over whoever this guy was because of the radio message. If Doris Holland was correct, Tippit stopped his car almost right in front of the driveway where that second police car she saw was situated, which would leave open the suggestion that Tippit was being lured not just out of the proper area, but to some kind of disguised trap door. Now, this is a very good point, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right, David, about what Tippit was doing the last hour of his life, right?
Right, I've heard about where he was, and things like that.
Yeah, now this is very interesting. And I took this information because, of course, it's not in the Warren Commission. So I took this information from Joe McBride's book, Into the Nightmare. Between noon and 12:35, Tippit was most likely on a shoplifting call and then home for lunch. At approximately 12:40, he was seen in his car by 5 witnesses at a Gloco filling station. Those witnesses said that he was looking at the Houston Viaduct, which crosses over from Dealey Plaza. About 90 seconds on that viaduct, and you're at Dealey Plaza. Now, just a few moments after this, Tippit pulled over a car driven by insurance agent James Andrews. He pulled him over, got out of his police car, and then started to look in the back of the car like he was looking for somebody. Andrews was very puzzled. He looked at the officer's nameplate. He said Tippit seemed to be very upset and agitated. His next stop is the Top 10 record store at 338 West Jefferson. All right, Louis Cortinas said, who knew Tippit fairly well, said Tippit came in, commandeered the phone, called someone, apparently did not get an answer, hung up and walked off, looking worried or upset. Now, it seems logical to assume from that set of events, of course, and I think you probably agree with me, it looks like Tippit was looking for someone to cross over the bridge by either car or bus. When that person did not arrive, he actually pulled over a car looking for someone. Frustrated, he then went ahead and tried to get somebody on the phone. And then he proceeded to his death at 10th and Patton, driving the car very slowly, like he was looking for someone. Now, this is a completely different perspective we now have, thanks to this new evidence, than what Jim Garrison or Henry Hurd had on the Tippit case. Now, in McBride's book, he interviewed a guy named Edgar Lee Tippit, J.D. Tippit's father, and he found out some interesting things that are not in the Warren Commission and that nobody else had. Edgar talked to Tippit's widow, and he said that, according to her, they called J.D., another policeman, and said that Oswald was headed in that direction. And this is what the other policeman told Marie. But he also added that the other boy stopped. He would have got there, but he had a little accident, a wreck. They both started out. J.D. made it. He'd been expecting something. The police notified them that Oswald was headed that way. Now, that has to be William Menzel, who, as I said earlier, was already in the area. Nelson had left. Now, Menzel verified some of the facts in this because he told the HSCA he had responded to an accident a little bit after 1 o'clock. And as we've seen, we know that Tippit did use a phone that day. And Menzel also reported he contacted the station by phone, not by police radio. And in an interview McBride did with Gary Revelle, he stated further, Wade told him that somebody reported to me that the police already knew who Oswald was, and they were looking for him at that time. Now, this is all, I'm going to have to tell you how fascinating it is. If that's true, then what that means is whoever put together the wallet at the scene of the Tippit murder, a small special part of the Dallas police, had been alerted to who the patsy was earlier. When Jerry Hill announced on the radio at 1:52 Oswald had been apprehended at the theater, it was only to the Tippit case, not the JFK case. Because the information in the wallet did not become known until the mid-90s, neither Henry Hurd or Garrison mentioned Westbrook or Croy. But they did mention Hill. Again, Hill, like Westbrook, was at the three major scenes, the Texas Theater, Dealey Plaza, and at 10th and Peyton. In addition, he was in the unmarked car that escorted Oswald to the police station. Hill was the policeman who first reported from the Tippit scene that the shells were automatic. Now, when Henry Hurd confronted him with this discrepancy, along with the fact that even though Hill instructed Poe to mark the shells with his initials, the markings had disappeared, Hill responded with one of the most farcical comments available in the literature. Hill said he could not imagine any kind of evidence manipulation because the police department was so clean it scared him. Now, as you know, that is so wrong and so false that it really kind of lends suspicion to Jerry Hill. All right, because as I wrote in my book, no other county in America, and almost no state for that matter, has freed more innocent people from prison in recent years than Tarrant County, which is where Dallas is, where Mr. Wade was a DA from 1951 through 1986. Of course, Wade was a DA who supervised the Kennedy and Tippit cases. And what makes that even worse, how dirty the Dallas police were, is that none of this would have come out unless there was a power shift in the city in 2006. All right, the city elected its first African-American district attorney in over a half century. Craig Watkins was not from the Good Old Boys Network. He never worked for Wade or met Wade. And he criticized Wade by saying there was a cowboy kind of mentality And the reality is that that kind of approach is archaic, racist, elitist, and arrogant. And he began a review of private convictions. Literally dozens of innocent people were now set free. In 3 cases, the charge was murder. He said Wade's cases were riddled with shoddy investigation, evidence was ignored, and defense lawyers were kept in the dark. In other words, the combination of Wade with homicide detective Will Fritz made for a thoroughly corrupt local law enforcement system. In pure numbers, the worst in America at that time.
I think it's such an important point because when you take away the fact that it's Kennedy and that it's a case that everybody's looked at, Oswald is just another guy in Dallas who's kind of been railroaded by bad police work and a kind of corrupt system there. It's not out of character for Dallas. When you take away the fact that it's the president, it's just another day in Dallas.
Right. You're exactly correct. Now, in October of 1963, and this is, I think, really interesting, Hill went on what he called a special assignment. He was detailed over to the Personnel Division to work under Westbrook. There was never any question by the Warren Commission as to why that transfer happened at that time, or once before the assassination, especially in light of the fact that Westbrook already had 6 people working for him. It was Hill who had possession of the handgun taken from Oswald upon the arrival of the suspect at the police station. Although there is some confusion about who actually did have possession, of that handgun. But when Hill arrived at the station, he placed the gun in Westbrook's office while he wrote a report. And then, we're talking the personnel office. It should have gone to homicide, right? So this was so odd that Westbrook himself admitted to the commission that the gun should not have been there. So one last thing about this. According to the Warren report, the .38 Smith & Wesson was ordered by Oswald and was delivered not by the post office, but a private company called Railway Express Agency. This was a kind of forerunner of Federal Express. And to order a handgun, you had to have an ID and what they call a character reference. All right? They would go ahead and ship the handgun to you at your P.O. box, and you would have a card there, and you would go to their REA office, produce the ID and the character reference, pay for the revolver, get a receipt, and they would record the transaction. Well, to make a long story short, there is no proof that any of that ever happened. In other words, there's no paper trail that leads from the card being picked up to Oswald going to the REA office and the transaction being processed by REA. In fact, there isn't even any proof the FBI ever went to the Railway Express Agency in Dallas to check out the transaction. And, of course, why would Oswald order the weapon under an alias, which of course was Heidel, knowing the summons card by REA had to go to a P.O. box under his real name? See, the Warren Commission never asked those questions, let alone answered them. Now, as Hill was making out his report, he says Westbrook told him to alter the report to say that Oswald was a suspect not just in the Tippit case, but also in the murder of President Kennedy. Again, when Hill said that, there was no question by the Warren Commission at all as to, well, wait a minute. Did you ask him what he based that on? How would you know that early, that he was also a suspect in the Kennedy case? And by the way, there was no, in checking through Westbrook's testimony, there's nothing there that says they cross-checked it. In other words, nobody said, did you tell Jerry Hill to add to his offense report that Oswald was also a suspect in the Kennedy case? Nobody asked that question. Because the obvious thing you want to know is, what did you base that on at that time? All right, it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, at 5 p.m., Hill did an interview on the radio that went national. Hill was a very experienced print and TV journalist who covered the Dallas police beat out of an office at the station before joining the force. During that interview, with the Sacramento radio station, Hill did about everything he could to incriminate Oswald in the public mind. All right, this was before Oswald had been arraigned on either charge, before the FBI had linked him to the weapons, before the Bureau had tested for fingerprints or ballistics. Hill accused Oswald of being a violent person who may have shot another policeman previously, which of course he just made that up out of thin air. Hill also said Oswald would not admit that he pulled the trigger on the gun in a theater, which of course he did not, because the FBI confirmed that the firing pin never hit the bullet. Okay. He said Oswald admitted during interrogation he was an active communist. All right. Hill talked about Oswald's time in Russia. All right. How he knew that is just unbelievable at that time. And that was, of course, the beginning of a motive.
The boy that we apprehended for shooting Officer J.D. Tippit is an employee of the bookbindery where the shots that killed the president were fired from. He was seen on the floor below the window where the shots were fired some 15 minutes prior to the shooting. He was a former U.S. Marine marksman who defected to Russia in 1957 and returned to the United States approximately a year ago with a Russian bride, I understand. He did admit in the interrogation a while ago he was an active communist. He has not admitted the shooting of the president or the governor or the police officer, but a gun was found on the 6th floor where it had been hidden that I have been told, and I can't verify this either way, was made in Argentina. The man, I understand, has resorted to violence before and possibly shot another policeman somewhere. He won't admit anything other than he was a communist. He started screaming brutality as soon as we got the handcuffs on him. And when he got down here and was talking to Fritz and them, the only thing he said is, when I told you I was a communist, I admitted everything. I'm going to tell you your words to that effect. And I want a lawyer. I demand my rights.
Hill said that he got most of this stuff from Westbrook.
Wow.
As most.
And this is at 5 p.m., 4 hours?
Yeah.
5 hours after the fact?
Yeah, this is like, because I think Oswald was taken down to the station at about 2 p.m. And he's writing a defense report saying that, Westbrook told him to put him in there for the Kennedy case. Then he goes on the air just a couple hours later and he broadcasts to the world all this incriminating evidence, and it's Oswald. Now there's...
And this is...
Go ahead.
This is basically the first time, I remember Bill Simpich saying this is basically the first time that anybody had said this publicly, right?
I wouldn't say that for sure, but I would think that that's probably the case, yes.
Wow.
Yes. Now, as most people familiar with the JFK case understand, there's usually a punchline with these weird and mysterious matters. In this one, it's the following. Within 1 year of the publication of the Warren Report, Westbrook resigned the Dallas Police Department. He later became an advisor to the security forces in Saigon. That assignment was handled through the Agency for International Development. And those who follow the JFK case know that AID often worked under the auspices of the CIA. In light of these later revelations, I think the J.D. Tippit case takes on a new significance. As Deputy Bill Alexander once said to Henry Hurt, he knew that the man who killed Tippit had killed Kennedy. As Evan Marshall, a former 20-year homicide investigator, told the late Harry Livingstone, the Tippit shooting has always been to me a red herring of the first order. As somebody who spent 20 years as a big city cop, I can assure you that nothing affects a cop like the murder of a brother officer. Perhaps the hope was that the officers would respond to the Texas theater, would kill the suspect there. When Joe McBride was doing his book, Into the Nightmare, he talked to Jim Lavelle, who said, the the Kennedy killing wasn't really a big deal to us when you get right down to it, because it was just another murder inside the city limits of Dallas that we would handle. It was just another murder to me. And I've handled hundreds of them. So it wasn't any big deal. But what people don't understand, Lavelle continued, is that a police officer, his murder takes precedence over the shooting of the president, because that's close to home. And this is what I believe happened here. This is what seemed to happen. Whoever planned this thing understood that the Dallas police would go crazy when they found out that Tippit had been murdered, and they would instantly relate that case to the Kennedy case, that they both must have been at the hands of the same man. Now, I can't prove that. I can't come close to the reasonable doubt standard. But I have very little doubt as somebody like Dick Sprague, the first chief counsel of the HSCA, had this evidence in his hand. He would have investigated this avenue. He would have investigated Westbrook, Croy, and Hill. He would have found Doris Holland. He would have tried to find out who really gave the information, that description, that 5'10", 165, armed with a weapon, to the Dallas police. He would have gone to the post office. He would have gone to Railway Express to figure out how the heck did Oswald get that handgun if there's no trail that he did so. That and much more would have all been part of a real investigation of the Tippit case, which is not at all even in the same universe with what happened. And as a result, the people who arranged for, and I believe actually killed Tippit, succeeded tactically in a spectacular way. For in 30 minutes after the ambulance carted Tippit's body away, more than a half a dozen police cars descended on a Texas theater in response to a reported infraction. 6 cruiser cars drive up in the front and back because somebody didn't pay to get into the movie. And that was enough to lower the noose around Oswald's neck. Once apprehended and handcuffed, Westbrook ordered the arresting officers to get Oswald in the car and take him to the station. At 1:52, Jerry Hill made the announcement that they had their man in the murder of Officer Tippit. And as we have seen, Westbrook, the guy who would soon be working with the CIA, then told Hill to add President Kennedy as the other victim. And that was that. So in other words, Dave, in the space of something like a little bit more than 2.5 hours, the Dallas police managed to solve 2 murder cases. All right, all because the ticket taker at the Texas theater said somebody walked into the show without paying. Pretty good police work, huh?
Yeah, for a police department that never writes down where they get evidence, or
right.
Pretty effective.
But Garrison said, I don't know if it's in his book or not, but he found out that Hoover had actually put out a list on the Tippit case of who not to talk to. And that's what he thinks happened. Which would be, look, you've got a police force as corrupt as the Dallas police. Then you got J. Edgar Hoover, who hated the Kennedys, running the thing in Washington. So there was no chance this case was going to be solved. Neither Tippit or Oswald.
Right. Let me ask one thing about Tippit specifically. In all the literature on him, what's the idea of his background? Was there any evidence that maybe he was a dirty cop? Why is there any reason that he specifically would be sacrificed in this sort of way?
That's something, because this article was pretty long to begin with. That's something, I decided, not to really go into, because it would have probably been about 7 pages longer, and I think it's 20 pages already. So McBride did try and dig some of that stuff up. And there's a possible connection between Tippit and Ruby, because Tippit was a security guard at Austin's Barbecue. And a part owner of that was Ralph Paul. Ralph Paul was also the guy who financed Ruby's purchase of his 2 strip clubs in Dallas. So there's a possible connection. Ruby's sister actually said that Tippit had been in the Carousel Club more than once. So there's a possible connection there between Ruby and Tippit. All right. Also, if you can believe this, he was also at one time a security guard at the Texas Theater, which is the place where Oswald was arrested at. Again, maybe that's just a coincidence, but I find that kind of interesting. And he was having an affair with a woman who was a waitress from Austin's Barbecue, and she happened to live in the Oak Cliff area. According to McBride, who interviewed her, she said that their affair had ended a few months before Kennedy's assassination. So those are all kind of interesting things. And of course, as McBride found out in his book, there was an inordinate number of racist and even Klan members in the Dallas police. I mean, McBride, the whole section of his book, a couple pages is on that particular subject. The Dallas police did not get that reputation for being so terrible and corrupt because they were really good people on that police force, because they couldn't have been.
Right.
And the thing is, like you said earlier, because Westbrook had the files on everybody, because Tippit never got a promotion in 11 years. Yeah, he was a patrolman. So, and I'm only throwing this out as a suggestion, speculation. Maybe they told him, this is going to be your way to become an officer. Okay, we're going to give you the goods on Oswald. And then what happened, of course, is they turned it around on him. Right? At least that's, now again, as I said in the article, I can't prove any of this. But all I can say is that it's really weird that none of this evidence was out there until the 90s, which shows you how bad the Warren Commission was. Because that film of the Oswald wallet, that was there at that local TV station. There's no reason the Warren Commission could not have gotten it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, you would think that would be one of the first things that they would do, would be gather up all of the film, especially of the Tippit, a specific location like the Tippit murder scene.
Right.
And that wallet to me was, that's some pretty heavy-duty evidence, and to have the actual film of it, it's clear that it's not just, this isn't just a story, or you can't just say it's just hearsay.
And by the way, it's not just Barrett who certified that as being Oswald's wallet. Lieutenant Jez, as I wrote in my article, who I think was the second or third person at the scene of the Tippit killing, told Martha Moyer, who's a very good researcher in Dallas, he told her, don't let anybody bamboozle you. That was Oswald's wallet. So in my opinion, it's very hard to dispute today that somebody brought that wallet to the scene of the Tippit shooting. And it really looks today like somebody in the Dallas police, a small little sector of it, somehow knew that Oswald was the guy that they were going to frame.
Right. And, well, you don't have to go, the connections are so immediate between Alan Dulles to Charles Cabell, Dulles' deputy, to Cabell's brother, the mayor of Dallas, to right into the...
His brother, Earl Cabell, was a mayor, and it's the declassified documents now say that Earl Cabell was a CIA asset from 1959. And then we got this other guy, Westbrook, who's going to join up with the CIA after he resigns the force in 1964. Some people can say, well, those kind of things happen. Well, when they happen over and over and over and over and over, I'm sorry, it's not a coincidence, okay?
I don't know. I think that, some of the things that maybe the church committee looked into, I don't know that they looked into anything specifically like that, but there were definitely some things where they looked into the CIA were training local police, where the FBI were training local police, but that they were infiltrate. If the CIA was going to infiltrate the media, then they would certainly infiltrate police. And if you wanted to infiltrate a police department, what better position to have than the personnel department, where you basically get to oversee everybody who's coming in and going out, and you basically have their job in your hands. So, this was great. Thank you very much for doing this, and look forward to your. Is the book out? Can people get it on Amazon?
Yes, the book is out. You can order it now. Yes,
and it's got a foreword by Oliver Stone. That looks great.
Correct.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks a lot for doing this, and people should go read the full article. There's a lot more there if they go to kennedysandking.com, and thanks a lot, Jim.
Okay, you're welcome, David.
This is Our Hidden History